Welcome to Art History. We begin our lecture series with the concept of always supporting any type of argument or claim about an artwork with evidence. If you're claiming that this is the meaning or the original function or the artist intended this, you always support any claim with visual evidence. In fact, during my undergrad, I remember being told that law schools love art historians because we have so much practice already supporting an argument with evidence. Anecdotal, I know, but even peers and friends that I've had in art history have either taken the education route like myself or are now practicing lawyers. So this makes sense. So what I mean by this is always support any claim or argument with visual evidence. Okay. Now I also want to introduce the concept of agency. And this is especially pertinent to understanding many of the artworks from this semester because we don't have exact records and written descriptions, etc., of these artworks, particularly true with our first unit of prehistory. But I do want us to understand that these artworks affect us. So what do I mean by agency? If we start with Van Gogh's Starry Night, this is probably a familiar artwork, hence why I chose it, even though it's not from this semester. But many people have a reaction to this. When I ask students, how do you feel when looking at this artwork? Oftentimes they'll say calm or almost sad because of the blue colors, the swirling brush strokes, the haziness of the light, etc. So what I mean by agency is that that artwork has had an effect on us, the viewer. Okay. Now, if we talk about Michelangelo's Pietà, again, not from this unit, but you've most likely heard of Michelangelo. This artwork is a prime example of having such an effect on the viewer that it's actually even been physically attacked. It has been chipped, and there was a crack that was mended from a person running up and attacking it with a hammer. So they had such a reaction to this artwork that they felt the need to attack it. Again, these artworks affect us, the viewer. Now, the Shiva Nataraj, which we will study in a later unit this semester, I would like to spend a moment on for us to better understand the ancient world. So the Shiva Nataraj is one of many sculptures like this. And in Hinduism, Shiva is a god, and part of the purpose of this sculpture is during specific ceremonies, during specific holidays, there would be this whole entire ceremony of presenting food and drink to this sculpture, of dressing this sculpture. During this ceremony also, incense would be used. So what this would do is it starts to appeal to our senses. There would be music going on and bells. It would be taken as a processional object in parades down the streets. And so through this whole process, there's almost this coming alive ceremony to where this enables worshipers to commune directly with Shiva Nataraj. There's the belief that performing these ceremonies enables Shiva to come through this sculpture, and therefore the followers can commune directly with their god. And so this has a great effect on the viewers. And so when we call this an art object or an artwork, in a way it almost demeans the importance of this work. It's so much more. It's religious, it's spiritual, and it affects people's lives essentially. And so when we're looking at the ancient world, much of the works that we'll study had an intended, important effect on the viewers. They weren't just sterile art objects placed on the wall of a museum. That's a very modern concept. So I just want us to appreciate the agency and how the artwork affects the viewer. That they had agency on us, and have. Okay, let's talk about identification for your artworks. On your handout, the full identification, I'll begin with the artist. However, for much of this semester, we will not have an artist listed. They were unknown. It's not until really the Middle Ages when it becomes more commonplace for artists to sign their works. If I do have an artist, I'll put it in capital letters to really differentiate between the title. So the title, when you are typing, you italicize it. When you are writing, you underline it. However, architecture is neither italicized nor underlined. Then it'll be followed by the style or the culture, such as this Starry Night, Impressionism is the style, or when we're studying our prehistoric art, for culture I'll put prehistoric or the specific culture in which it comes from. Followed by the date in parentheses, and then the medium, the materials. That's our art history term for materials. Okay, so how to take notes. Write down as much as you can. Yes, it's worth it in the long run. Unit 1, Prehistoric Art. Okay, so we're in the prehistoric era. Now remember, prehistory means that this is in the time period before history was written down. So we have a lack of a written language. We don't know about one. Now there is some valid evidence about graphic communication, but again, we just don't know the exact details of these symbols. So the Paleolithic era is from 40,000 to 9,000-ish BCE. It really depends upon the location. Certain areas had agricultural and urban revolutions before others, but here's our general time period. Now I want to talk about the conditions of the Ice Age for us to better appreciate and understand the artworks that we'll study. So this is an Ice Age. It's extremely harsh. Low infant mortality rate. In other words, many children aren't living to see adulthood. There's also a high maternal mortality rate, so many women are dying during childbirth. The context of the artwork is unknown. Our assumptions about the purpose, the function, etc. are made by educated guesses. And also, from your readings, hopefully you understand that this is also, during our Paleolithic, a nomadic time period. So let's begin with our Venus of Willendorf, sometimes called New Woman. I'll refer to it as Venus of Willendorf. Almost all survey classes begin with this art object. It's one of the earliest images of the human body made by mankind. Now I want to talk about the name real quick. The nomenclature isn't accurate of this art object. Venus is a Roman goddess that doesn't come around for many thousands of years. But she was a nude goddess. So the early archaeologists who found this named it just Venus because it was a nude female. Willendorf is actually the name of the town in Austria where it was found. So Venus of Willendorf refers to the location primarily. Now it was discovered in 1908, again in this village of Willendorf. And so they think that it was most likely made by these nomadic hunter-gatherers. Now here's the interesting part. The limestone is not indigenous to Willendorf. So this attests to how these people were moving around this area over a vast amount of area. In fact, we found about 40 small portable human figurines, primarily female, across much of Europe. And they look very similar to this one. So there's a few things that this indicates. Number one, maybe there's something with human nature in which this need to create comes out through the female form early on, or the argument is made that these different peoples had contact with one another because they're small portable objects like this are so similar. But we don't know for sure. So the medium is limestone. Like I said, it wasn't from this area, so that indicates it came from somewhere else, and these were nomadic peoples. You'll see it has some reddish hue to it. It was tinted with some red ochre pigment. It was also likely very smooth originally. And we have to consider, this was from 23,000 BCE, that it's roughened up over time. It's incredibly small. It's smaller than what you would think. It's only 4 inches tall, so it can fit in the palm of most people's hands. It's also a sculpture in the round. Here's a side view. And what a sculpture in the round means is that the entire front, sides, back are all carved out. So it's not an object that would have been placed against a wall where there isn't an emphasis or a detailed back. It's small. And so this tells us that it was a portable object, that they would bring it with them. Now let's come back to the conditions of this time period during the Ice Age, is you aren't going to be carrying items that are not important to you when you're traveling such great distances in search of food. And so this attests to its importance, that this was brought by these nomadic people to different places. So we know it's important, just the fact that it's made. Now, let's discuss the body. So we have a female figure. Her breasts, her belly, her genitalia, her upper thighs are quite emphasized. Now, if what we'll notice is that what's missing here is her face. So here's where we come into our process of elimination as we speculate the original intentions of this art object or the meaning. So the lack of the face tells us that this was not a portrait of a specific person. So it's not that someone made this to commemorate their mother or their grandmother. The lack of a face tells us that this was not a person. And we also have some clues about what's not emphasized. So it's initially hard to recognize, but her arms are not emphasized within this art object. You can slightly see these little stick arms that are bent at the elbows and resting on her breasts. Some art historians argue that this shows that she wasn't as active with physical labor since her arms aren't emphasized. And so this draws us to the conclusion that perhaps this is associated with fertility because of the body parts that are emphasized. Some have referred to this as perhaps a goddess object. However, we don't know about their religions, and one of the go-tos for the ancient world, if we don't know about an artwork, we label it as religious or as a goddess or a god. And that could be very accurate, but I'm going to go more with the idea of fertility. So let me explain why I lean more toward this argument. Is when we come back to the harsh conditions of this time period, again, we have a high infant mortality rate. Conditions are harsh. It is difficult to survive. So when you're hoping for survival and you're considering the ideal, you're likely considering access to food. You are considering fertility, both with people and procreation, but also fertility of the land when you come back to that different area with whatever form of food you're consuming, and as well as fertility with the animals in which they were hunting. And so the fact that these parts of her female body are emphasized goes along with that idea of fertility. Perhaps it was a totem in which they could, again, carry around with them with this hope for fertility in all regards. Some other aspects of this item is the feet are missing, they likely weren't important, and also her cap. So it's described as a cap, but in other objects that are similar to this, the hair seems to be in a similar pattern, and then even, I know this is over 20,000 years later, or over that, but the ancient Greeks, early Greek art, many of the females had a similar pattern to their hair. And so I remember reading about one art historian describing it as braided hair. And my automatic assumption was this was likely a male who made this claim because it looks more like a dread pattern, because had it been braided, it would have been this cross-hatching pattern perhaps. And so in some of the other objects, we could argue that it's hair. In this one, though, the general consensus is that they call it more of a cap. We're not really sure, but there is some detail there. Now, another thing about ancient art is that the artists would work with the imperfections of the materials that they were using. So her belly button actually was not made by the artist. It was a natural indentation within the stone. So this artist worked around that as a focal point for them as they worked to create this. It was already there. Okay, so again, the function is likely for fertility of the land, of the people, animals, etc. Maybe a good luck totem, a mother goddess, but the most likely association is fertility. Okay, Venus of Willendorf. So some useful formal and descriptive terms, in which I've already dived into, is the technique of how the art object is made, the size and the scale, composition, the arrangement of these different formal elements, space, how do the objects occupy space, do the forms overlap, do they project into space, are they contained, what's the perspective, regarding color, what's the hue, the value, intensity or purity of the color, line, or outlines or contour lines, is it decorative, linear, and the texture, is it smooth, rough, etc. Now let's move into cave paintings. So we're going to begin with the Chauvet cave in France. We have found about 400 caves in Europe thus far, primarily in Spain and France. This makes sense with the beginning of humanity, beginning in Africa, right below, if we look on our map. I'm sure that there are many that have yet to be uncovered. So here is the area of the Chauvet caves as we go into it. So these were discovered in 1994 by 3 cave explorers, and it's an extremely extensive cave. It's about 400 meters or a quarter of a mile long, and all these different chambers. Now the floor of the cave, it's littered with archaeological and paleontological remains. There's skulls, there's bones of cave bears, which hibernated there. There's a few skulls of an ibex, a type of goat, 2 wolves, scratches, some from the bear, some from human hands. Now let me preface by also saying, with all these cave art, or all this cave art, of course, the function in them is speculative to modern day archaeologists. We may never know the full intention and purpose of these cave paintings. However, there are a few items that tell us that these were extremely important and probably on the spiritual realm or associated with spiritual practices. So number one, these cave paintings are extremely difficult to get to. In all of these caves, they're not located right at the entrance. They're down passageways, some you have to get down and crawl through tunnels to get to. And so the fact that there are obstacles and that they're difficult to get to attests to their importance. They're not going to go through this effort to create something haphazardly or a doodle. They also did not reside in these caves. So the idea of people living in caves isn't very accurate. As I already mentioned, you have the remains of bears that lived in these caves, etc. But they just weren't hospitable. It's dark, it's damp, it's not comfortable. As well as our remains that are found it's not that they had fires, and there's no indication of them settling within these caves. We found evidence for that elsewhere, often not really near these caves, in fact. So again, these are far away, they're hard to get to, etc. So this tells us that they're important. We mostly see animals during this time period. The Paleolithic cave art that we have found are mostly animals. So the dominant animals throughout the cave are lions, mammoths, these furry rhinoceros that we'll see. So we have some examples here. So in this case, we have these lions. We have a bear. Some argue it's a hyena in the lower right. And if you'll notice, there's these variations of styles. Oops, I went too far ahead. Within this cave. I'll come back to that in Lascaux, but another important fact to mention is that many of these caves were used over hundreds, if not thousands of years. So different people are adding to the cave art and perhaps overlapping. So I want to talk about this panel of the lions. Here's a close-up of it. So this has really intrigued artists here, because initially it may seem almost like, oh, there's these overlapping sketches of an outline, of a lion. I jumped ahead to my next thought, is I want to talk about the lines here and introduce some formal elements. So all of these animals have this very thick black outline. Now in art history, we're going to use the art historical term of contour lines. So many of these animals are made up of contour lines. We also see attempts at shading, at modeling, to create this three-dimensional illusion on this two-dimensional wall, which is an advanced artistic technique. So what I want to emphasize here is that this isn't haphazardly done, that these people are not these primitive cavemen that are hunched over, grunting and without intelligence that we see in movies or cartoons and commercials, etc. That these ancient people were just as complex as we are. They had the same complex range of emotion, wants and desires, etc., just extremely different circumstances. Consider what they were in tune with, the seasons, the stars, etc., versus how we lack a lot of that knowledge and how we're in tune with and experts in other fields. But these people were extremely complex. They are not primitive people. I want us to come out of that mindset and know that these are complex people, that human nature is the same across time and across the globe. So that leads me into this idea, this argument that this panel of the lions is showing movement. So we've found in some of these caves this different types of almost pigment, but these concoctions that were likely used during religious ceremonies, or spiritual ceremonies. Now, we assume that many of these people had a shaman as a leader, so this is your religious leader. Even tribal cultures today have a shaman as their religious leader. And so one of the arguments for these caves is that they would perform these spiritual ceremonies that were very important to them. And so this shaman would perhaps consume some type of mind-altering substance. And so many argue that this panel of the lions is part of that spiritual altered state that the shaman is experiencing, or people of this within these caves. And so this is especially came about when you consider motion photography to an extent. So this horse in motion, I'm jumping far ahead with Muybridge, but there was this great argument for much of time of when a horse gallops, do they ever take all 4 feet off the ground? There's this grand debate. And so then they were able to take pictures that captured these moments for the first time, like in 1878, and it settled the debate because at one point all 4 feet come up. However, it was only these very slow motion photos that demonstrated that. And so the point being here is that when we look at these photographs that are put together to create this motion picture movie, is that movement, look at the horse's head especially going up and down, seems to mimic the position of these lion heads here. And so perhaps this shaman was in an altered state in which things looked slow motion to him, that this was him entering some type of spiritual realm. Some argue that the lack of humans and the emphasis on animals has to do with some association with this altered state, with this spiritual realm or this spirit animal that is important to these people. But it's neat that it perhaps shows motion. Now we also have handprints. We get to see the hands of these people from close to 30,000 years ago that were using these caves for different purposes. So this was created by, they would take this pigment and they would swish it around in their mouth and it would mix with their saliva. They'd put their hand on the wall and then they'd blow over it to create this outline, this negative handprint. Archaeologists have found the pigment that they would use and it had some toxic qualities to it. And so that may have also induced some of these altered state of minds and these spiritual practices. We have other versions of handprints too. So these may actually be some form of graphic communication. You'll see there's some dots on the screen, but these weren't haphazardly done. The shape of them indicates thought. And again, all of this, they aren't just necessarily doodling. And there's quite a bit of evidence recently that this is some form of graphic communication, such as a calendar system, etc., etc. So, complex humans. Okay. So, let's talk about the Lascaux caves and the Hall of the Bulls. So, the Lascaux caves are also in France. And again, we see many of these similar animals that we've already looked at. Now, the fun part about the Lascaux caves is it was found on September 12th, 1940 by 4 teenagers who happened to come across it. There was this old tree that had fallen over, and there was a hole under the roots, and they crawled down, went exploring, and through these passageways came across these incredible works of art. So from the resources that you were assigned with this unit, hopefully you'll remember that they opened this cave system to visitors for a short period of time. And unfortunately, the moisture from people breathing, they also attempted certain areas, they put in AC units, but also the dirt and fungus that people brought in on the bottom of their shoes resulted in much of this cave being extremely damaged very quickly. And so this fungus especially it's an irreparable damage. But luckily, France tried to quickly make up for this and take pictures and copy these details, and they made that look-alike, that copycat, right next to them. And so you can visit a complete copycat of these caves. So a new art history term that I want to introduce is the concept of a ground line. And so if we look here, what I mean is it's the line that indicates the ground. And here, just like with our Venus of Willendorf, where he or she, the original artist, used the belly button, the natural indentation as a belly button. Here, these artists are using the curve of the cave where there's a darker shadow or rock as a natural ground line. And then they created these animals above it. You can also see there's all types of different styles of these animals. Some of them are lapping. This is one of the caves that was used for likely over 4,000 years. And so we have different artists coming in, different people coming in, and the overlapping of these figures likely indicates the passage of time and that different people are adding onto it. The different styles, etc. help attest to that as well. Again, we're utilizing the contour line primarily. I mean, as you can see, it's not that these early people were incapable of creating realistic images, which I want to emphasize this concept of conceptual art versus perceptual or optive. So what do I mean by that? These terms are on your handout, but we often, in our modern era, we consider much of the purpose of art is to create a realistic image. That was likely not at all the intention of these original artists. Is they weren't trying to create a realistic bull. It wasn't about just creating art to create art. Instead, they were trying to convey some type of concept, which we don't know, but these are more conceptual images. Okay, they give these images which give the notion, idea, or concept that's intended, of which the original viewers would have likely understood. Some have asked, is this depicting a hunting scene? And most art historians and archaeologists answer that it's not, because of the lack of human hunters within this. That again, these are all likely associated with some type of spiritual practice or even hope for a hunt. On that same realm, again, there's differing opinions by art historians, is some will make the claim, oh, well, it's not a hunting scene because they didn't eat all these animals, such as there's depictions of a bear. Well, they may not have eaten the bear, but they probably would have used the hide of the bear during an ice age to stay warm. So maybe even the hope to be able to access these animals could be an aspect of these cave paintings. Again, we have different types of styles. Look at the color and the shading created on part of the body of this animal to create this sense of three-dimensionality on a flat surface. Again, these dots that we see throughout these caves, they likely were not haphazard, and they probably do indicate some type of graphic meaning, such as a calendar system in which these bulls, etc., would be bountiful. That's a few arguments made. And again, these examples of these overlapping and different styles of figures likely indicates the passage of time and different people adding to it for various purposes. So this is the pregnant bull in the Lascaux cave. There are many, many horses, and so this one definitely has a much lower and emphasized belly. It is pregnant. And if you'll notice here, there's some interesting aspects of this. You may be drawn to above it. It has these lines. Again, we don't know the meaning. Originally thought to be graffiti or something, but likely some type of graphic communication. What you also may notice are these other lines in front of its chest and across its belly. So some people say that this mimics a wheat type grain, or it could indicate arrows. We're not sure. I don't have an explanation or any reasoning behind that, but it's interesting. Such a variation of different art within these caves. But I do want to talk about the bird-headed man and wounded bison, because here we have a figure. Although it's more of a stick figure, it's still a figure, which is incredibly rare during the Paleolithic era. So let's move into it. Our eyes are likely first drawn to this bull. If you'll notice what's going on here, so I'll give you a moment to just scan around this cave art and see if you can figure out what's going on. Okay, so you may have noticed that the bull, it seems to be in an attack mode. Again, these people were likely able to portray extremely realistic animals. They instead were more focused on the concept behind them. And I say that because look at how this artist made sure to show that the hair is standing up on end. So think of like when a cat gets scared or when they're in attack mode and how their hair stands up. Common in the animal world, and we see that here. Also the position of its head, where his horns are facing toward this figure. The tail is up, so we are definitely in an attack stance here. It's not a timid, frightful stance. What you're also probably noticing is these loops, these circles that are underneath its belly, and then this long line that slashes across the body, which leads your eye to another line below the feet of the figure. We also notice the figure. This figure isn't standing upright, it's at an angle, and then in the lower left there's this line with a bird on top. So many art historians argue that this is an example of a narrative, and so it's telling a story. And so the common argument here is that this is a depiction of some type of perhaps a hunting scene between a bull and a man. Those loops underneath the belly are the exact location of where the intestines would be. So it's the intestines hanging out. And we see the arrow, this long arrow or spear, that comes across that same area, indicating that that's how this happened. There's an arrow on the floor. And the position of this this man with this bird headdress on seems to be falling backward. So it seems that both died during this fight or this hunt scene. Now, consider the element of this bird motif, where we have the bird type shape on the male's head, obviously a male, and we also have the bird motif on top of this line. So many art historians, picture in your head this shaman with a headdress in the shape of a bird that also carries a staff with the shape of a bird in some form on top of it. So perhaps this bird is the shaman's spiritual animal, its spirit animal. And this may be commemorating the death of a great shaman. We don't know for sure, but it is fun to think about. And a lot of the evidence leads us to that conclusion of this narrative, to commemorate the death of this shaman. And again, against a formidable foe, that this isn't he's not shown larger than the bull or dominating it, that it was a formidable foe. Okay, let's move into Namibia, down into Africa. So here's our Apollo 11 stones, which will wrap up our Paleolithic art. Now, if you'll notice, it's called stones, but it's actually, originally it was on the wall of a cave. and it fell down and it cracked. So that's why it's split in two. Now this artwork is interesting. The nomenclature again is misleading. Apollo 11, the space shuttle, was actually, this art object was actually found during the Apollo 11 flight as it was up in space. So that's why they called it the Apollo 11 stones. So it just indicates the time in which they were found. So this is located in the Huns Mountains in Namibia. Here's a different version of it, less detailed and under different lighting. Now, it was found underneath the soil within this cave area. And this one was actually closer to the entrance. So some think it was either buried deliberately for some specific purpose, or it had just fallen down and been covered over time. We're not sure. The part on the right you can see was a little more worn down, but either way, at least we still have it. So they aged differently a little bit. This was drawn with a pigment crown. Yeah, it's thought to be the oldest known artwork of any kind on the entire African continent, until there was a 1,000-year-old piece of ochre pigment with a geometric pattern found in South Africa. The origin of humanity, most likely, so that makes sense. But it's one of the oldest pieces of artwork. So this is difficult to date, though. In fact, I should have prefaced by this that radiocarbon dating could even be off by like 1,000 years. I was warned by one archaeologist of that. So we're not exactly sure, but we're at least close. Okay, so let's talk about the actual artwork and what are we seeing here. Let's start with the left side. So some argue that the head mimics the shape of a feline head. So think of how we've seen lions, and this is the continent of Africa, so this was an indigenous animal. So there is a feline aspect to the head. But then you move down, and the front two limbs do not appear to be so feline. So we're not really sure. Perhaps so. But then when we move over to the right, something interesting happens. So first we can see that it's likely a male, but I want you to take a moment and compare the front two limbs to the back two limbs. So once you look, you notice this slight difference. The back limbs appear more human-like. So some argue that this is again some type of like spiritual shaman, spirit animal associated with some ritual process. We're not sure, but it's interesting that this was an intentional difference between the front legs and the hind legs. Oh, I forgot to mention, I apologize. On the head, there also appears to be two horns, perhaps. So it's this anthropomorphic mix of different animals. Perhaps it's some type of supernatural creature. Perhaps it represents something that this person experienced on this spiritual journey. But either way, it's interesting the intentional details in which this artist made. So that wraps up our Paleolithic art period.